It was well past midnight when I caught the last train home. The carriage was nearly empty. Just a man in a wrinkled suit slumped in the far corner, and a young woman staring blankly at her phone. The fluorescent lights overhead flickered now and then, and each flicker seemed to stretch the shadows along the floor into long, trembling lines. I remember glancing at the route map above the doors. 34 stops in total, all of them familiar. My station was the 27th. We passed through the 25th without incident. The low, rhythmic clatter of the wheels on the track had a hypnotic effect, and my thoughts began to drift. I almost didn't notice when the train slowed earlier than expected. The speakers crackled softly, as though about to announce something, but no words came. Then the doors slid open to a platform I had never seen before. It wasn't on the map. The tiles along the platform were a pale green, cracked in places, with dark stains spreading like veins beneath the glaze. The name of the station wasn't displayed anywhere, not on the walls, not above the exits. Instead, old posters clung stubbornly to the tiles, their corners curled and brittle. They advertised products I half recognized, but the typography, the clothing styles, the faces, they all looked decades out of date, as if they belonged to another time entirely. The man in the suit didn't move. The young woman didn't even glance up from her phone. But I felt an inexplicable pull, a quiet insistence like a hand at my back, urging me to step outside. The air beyond the doors carried a faint metallic tang, the kind you smell in the moments before a summer storm. I told myself I'd only look, just for a moment. The floor under my feet was cooler than it should have been, as though the concrete had been sitting in shadow for hours. A soft hum, low and constant, vibrated faintly through the soles of my shoes. The train behind me waited, doors still open, but the interior now seemed brighter than it had been, almost glaring compared to the dim, yellowish light that pooled along the platform. At the far end, a narrow corridor led into darkness. Something about it felt wrong, not threatening exactly, but weighted, as if the air there was thicker, older. I glanced back at the train, expecting to see the two passengers still seated. But the windows were empty. I was alone. The silence was the first thing that began to press on me. It wasn't the ordinary hush of an empty station. It was deeper, layered, as though all the usual sounds, the distant rumble of other trains, the faint hum of overhead wires, had been carefully removed. My ears strained for anything. The hiss of air through vents, the faint click of cooling metal from the train. Nothing. I turned back toward the carriage, intending to step inside, but the interior looked different now. The lights had dimmed to a weak amber glow, and the seats seemed wrong. The upholstery was the same shade, but the fabric looked older, threadbare in places. I couldn't see the man in the suit or the girl with the phone. The windows reflected only my own figure standing there on the platform, and behind me, a smear of darkness where the corridor waited. The doors slid shut without warning. No chime, no announcement. The sound they made was dull, almost reluctant, like wood being pushed into place rather than metal. My chest tightened. I stepped toward them, but the train began to move, pulling away with a sluggish momentum. In seconds, it was gone, swallowed by the tunnel beyond. The platform was mine now. I told myself to stay in the lit area, to wait. Someone had to come eventually. But the yellow lights overhead flickered again, and this time they didn't return to full brightness. Each pulse left the station dimmer, the shadows heavier. My gaze kept drifting to the far end, where the narrow corridor yawned open. There was something about that darkness that felt patient, as if it knew I would come eventually. I took a few hesitant steps toward it. The tiles underfoot shifted from the pale green of the main platform to a mottled gray, speckled with darker stains. The hum I'd felt earlier grew more pronounced. Not louder exactly, but closer. as though it was coming from beneath the floor. The air changed too, colder now, with that faint metallic tang sharpened by something else. Something like damp paper and old stone. The corridor walls were close enough that I could brush them with my fingertips. The tiles here were smaller, uneven, and in the dim light, I thought I could see shapes beneath the glaze. Faint outlines of letters, maybe numbers, as if something had once been written here and then sealed away. My footsteps echoed faintly, the sound flattening strangely, as though the space were swallowing it before it could bounce back. After a dozen paces, I saw the glow, faint, greenish, and shifting slightly, as though from a light source that swayed. I slowed, my pulse in my throat. The hum beneath the floor matched the rhythm of my heartbeat now, or maybe the other way around. And then I heard it. Faint, deliberate footsteps ahead. Too slow to be hurrying, too even to be random. Someone was there, moving deeper into the station that didn't exist. I stopped walking, but the footsteps ahead did not. They continued at the same slow, measured pace, the sound barely louder than the faint hiss of my own breath. Whoever it was seemed in no hurry, yet the rhythm carried a strange inevitability, like someone walking through a dream, knowing exactly where they were going because they had walked it 1,000 times before. The greenish light grew clearer as I moved forward again, the corridor widening into a low-ceilinged chamber. The source of the glow was an old glass lamp hanging from a chain, its surface clouded and pitted, as if it had been underwater for years. The light it cast was uneven, shifting across the tiled walls in a way that made the space feel alive, as though the shadows were breathing. I caught sight of movement in the far corner. A figure turned away from me, standing very still. The coat they wore was long, heavy, and the fabric had the dull sheen of something waxed against rain. Their hair, or perhaps a hat, was dark, blending into the gloom above their shoulders. I opened my mouth to speak, but the sound caught in my throat. The hum beneath the floor had changed pitch. It now matched the pace of the figure's breathing. They didn't turn, didn't acknowledge me, just lifted one arm slightly and pointed toward another tunnel that led away from the chamber. The gesture was slow, deliberate, and oddly formal, like a signal in an old photograph. My instinct screamed to turn back. The train might return, someone might come looking. But another part of me, quieter, heavier, reminded me that the train had already gone, and that this station hadn't existed on the map in the first place. I stepped closer to see their face. There wasn't one. Or rather, there was the faint suggestion of features beneath something translucent, like glass fogged from the inside. I felt an almost physical pressure in my chest, as if the air here was denser. The figure lowered their arm and began to walk toward the tunnel they had indicated. Their steps made no sound now, yet I knew exactly where they were. I followed. Not because I wanted to, but because the idea of staying behind in that chamber felt worse. The tunnel beyond sloped downward. The walls here were different. Bare concrete, cold to the touch, with streaks of moisture running in uneven lines. The air carried the smell of wet stone mixed with something faintly metallic, like rusted iron. I could no longer hear the hum from before, but in its place came a low, irregular creak, as though something massive was shifting very slowly far beneath us. We walked like that for what felt like minutes, maybe longer. Time was strange here. There was no sense of it passing. My thoughts began to wander in ways that felt dangerous. Memories surfacing that I hadn't touched in years. Faces from my childhood emerging in sharp detail. Even scents from rooms I hadn't entered in decades. And threaded through them all was the same question. How did you get here? The figure ahead finally stopped. They stood at the mouth of another space, larger than the last chamber, its darkness broken only by a pale glow from somewhere above. I stepped past them, feeling their presence like a cold current in the air, and saw what the light revealed. Rows of benches lined the floor, but they were nothing like the benches in any station I knew. They were made of dark wood, polished and warped with age, each one holding a scattering of objects: a glove, a child's shoe, a folded newspaper yellowed with time. None of them looked abandoned in haste. They looked placed, arranged, as if someone had been collecting them. And every single bench faced a single narrow track that vanished into pure black. The benches unnerved me more than the faceless figure ever had. There was something painfully deliberate about them, as though each object, each fragment of a life, had been chosen to sit here forever. A child's shoe with frayed laces, a folded scarf that still held the faint impression of the knot that once held it around someone's neck. A train ticket, punched but never torn in half. I moved slowly along the first row, the soles of my shoes whispering against the dust-coated floor. The air here was heavier, saturated with the faint scent of ozone and something more intimate, like the stale perfume that lingers in the folds of an old coat. I wanted to touch the objects, to reassure myself they were real, but some instinct kept my hands stiffly at my sides. The faceless figure stood at the far end of the hall, near the track, motionless. It no longer pointed, but the tilt of its head suggested it was watching me, though no eyes were there to do it. I should have been afraid, really afraid. But instead, there was a strange, creeping calm, like I was no longer in control of how my body responded. The single track gleamed faintly, not from any light above, but as though it had been polished by countless trains that no longer passed through here. Beyond the platform's edge, the tunnel gaped wide and black, its curve swallowing any notion of what lay ahead. The darkness there was different from ordinary absence of light. It was dense, almost textured, as if it might resist you if you tried to step into it. I realized then that I had stopped listening for the train to return. That thought, which should have been the only one keeping me anchored, had simply gone. I was no longer waiting to leave. I was waiting for something else. A soft vibration shivered through the floor beneath my feet. It was subtle at first, like a distant rumble of thunder, but it grew steadily until the objects on the benches trembled in place. My chest tightened, not from fear, but from recognition. I knew this sensation. I had felt it countless times standing on normal platforms, moments before a train's arrival. The faceless figure turned to face the tunnel, and I found myself mirroring it without thinking. The darkness ahead seemed to deepen, pulling the pale light of the hall toward it, and the air shifted with the faint scent of wet iron and earth. Somewhere in the distance, a sound began, the slow, metallic rhythm of wheels on tracks, echoing impossibly far away yet growing closer. I thought about the objects again. The ticket, the scarf, the shoe. Were they left behind because their owners had boarded, or because they hadn't? The rumble grew louder, but the darkness at the tunnel's mouth didn't brighten. No headlights pierced it, no shape emerged. Only the sound and the sensation of something vast approaching, moving with a patience that made my skin crawl. I felt the figure beside me lean ever so slightly forward, like a passenger preparing to step aboard. And in that moment, I understood that the choice, the only choice, was no longer whether to leave, but whether I would remain myself if I did. The sound filled everything. It was no longer just in my ears. It was in my chest, my teeth, the backs of my eyes. A slow, heavy approach, like the weight of time itself grinding forward. The track ahead trembled faintly, yet the darkness beyond remained absolute, swallowing every imagined glimpse of form or movement. The faceless figure stepped closer to the platform's edge. It didn't turn to me, didn't beckon, but I felt its presence press against my thoughts, urging, almost inviting. And then I realized it wasn't trying to convince me. It was waiting to see what I would choose, I looked at the benches again. The scattered objects seemed different now, less like remnants and more like markers, anchors to something that had already passed. I imagined each one once in the hands of a living person, warm with the touch of skin, now placed here as if to say, I was here. I left, and I understood, with a slow, sinking certainty, that whatever came down this track, it would not take you anywhere you knew. It would take you where you belonged, or where you were supposed to have been all along. A part of me fought to remember the world above, the station map with 34 stops, the faint hum of electric lights in familiar tunnels, the chatter of strangers. But those memories felt thin, transparent, like they belonged to someone I'd been pretending to be. The air here was real, the silence was real, the pull in my chest was real. The rumble reached a pitch where it felt almost like a heartbeat. Not mine, not human, but something vast and patient. And then, movement. Not light, not shape, just the subtle displacement of air. The undeniable sense that something enormous had arrived at the edge of the platform. I could see nothing, but the darkness felt closer, pressing forward like a tide. The figure stepped into it. No hesitation, no sound, just gone, swallowed whole without resistance. The pressure in the air shifted, leaving me exposed, alone on the platform's edge. I stood there, the pull stronger than ever. My mind whispered a dozen reasons to step forward. Curiosity, escape, belonging. But beneath all of them was something more dangerous. Acceptance. The understanding that if I left, I would not miss who I had been. My foot moved. The platform felt suddenly thin beneath me, like a skin stretched over water. The darkness seemed to lean in. I thought about my name, about the address of my apartment, about the faces of people who might still wonder where I'd gone. And then I realized those details were already fading. Not erased, but slipping into some unreachable part of me. I stepped forward. There was no sensation of falling, no cold rush of air, just a sudden, absolute stillness, as though the world had shut its eyes. And in that stillness, a voice, not sound but thought, settled into me like it had always been there. You were never on the map. When I opened my eyes again, I was standing in a station. The tiles were clean, the lights bright. A route map hung above the doors. 34 stops, all familiar. My station was still the 27th. The train was already pulling in. I stepped aboard, found an empty seat, and for a moment, I almost believed nothing had happened, until I glanced up at the map again and saw a faint, pale smudge between the 25th and 26th stop. No name, no number, just a blank space that seemed to pulse when I looked at it too long. And I knew I hadn't come back. Not really.